Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. Marco Polo. The man once called a liar, a dreamer, the million himself. And yet he was the one who traveled for 24 years, from Venice to the palace of the great Khan in China, and told of a world Europe could not even imagine. In this video, you will learn how he found himself at the court of Kublai, why he passed through Persia, Tibet, and Java, why his book was deemed a fantasy, and how it nonetheless changed the Western view of the East. This is not a legend. It is the story of a man who once left and returned to describe everything he had seen. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. Marco Polo was born in the year 1254 in Venice, a city that in that age breathed the sea, trade, and the thirst for profit. Here, canals replaced streets, boats replaced carts, and on the quays, merchants, sailors, porters, and craftsmen crowded day and night. The air smelled of salt, resin, fish, spices, and wine. Venice lived not as a closed city, but as a gateway to the world, through which not only goods arrived, but rumors, languages, customs, books, money, and destinies. The Polo family belonged to the honorable merchant class. They were not nobles and did not seek titles. Their ambitions lay elsewhere, in expanding trade connections, strengthening reputation, and accumulating capital that did not gather dust in chests but worked, in travel, in credit, in exchange. Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, and his brother Maffeo owned a trading house that operated not only in Venice, but also beyond it, first in Constantinople and later in Crimea. It was from there, from the port city of Sudak, that they began their first long voyage, a journey that unexpectedly led them to the court of the Mongol ruler Kublai in China. When Niccolo and Maffeo set out, Marco had not yet been born. He came into the world while his father was thousands of kilometers away, in a realm that Venetians considered almost mythical. His childhood passed without a father's presence. His mother and relatives raised him, and the Polo home was full of rumors, maps, merchants, and voices from every corner of the Mediterranean. Marco grew up where tales of distant lands were not fairy stories but part of daily life. Merchants discussed the price of pepper in Malabar, muslin from Bengal, gemstones from Ceylon, and each conversation became a lesson, not in geography, but in the structure of the world. As a boy, Marco was not bookish, but observant and sharp-minded. He did not strive for Latin or theology, but he memorized dozens of city names, ports, routes, and goods, listened to the adults, and built a mental map of the world, not an academic one, but a living one, full of smells, names, and numbers. He knew in which month ships sailed from Tyre, where to buy the finest glass, how long the road to Baghdad took, and how to tell genuine Chinese fabric from imitation. No one taught him this intentionally. He absorbed it naturally. When he was about 15 years old, Niccolo and Maffeo returned home. For almost 15 years, they had been thought either dead or lost forever. Yet they reappeared, not empty-handed and not as fugitives. They brought gold, jewels, silks, Persian carpets, rare spices, exotic clothes, and, most importantly, a letter from the great Khan Kublai himself, addressed to the Pope of Rome. In it, the ruler of China requested that learned theologians be sent to explain the foundations of Christianity and share knowledge. No such message had ever before reached Europe. When Niccolo saw his son, he immediately recognized not only his blood but also his mind, cautious, deliberate, and persistent. Affection grew quickly between them, founded not on memories but on mutual understanding. The father and uncle began preparing for a second journey, intending to return to Asia to deliver Kublai's letter and to expand their trade network. But since Pope Clement IV had died and the election of his successor was delayed, the brothers had to wait, and during that time decided to take Marco with them. The young man did not resist. There was no fear in him. Perhaps he did not fully understand how long and arduous the road would be, but he felt his life would not be spent behind a counter or in the shadow of a canal. The world held too many places spoken of only in whispers, too many cities unmarked on any map, too many peoples unknown in Europe, and he wanted to see them. Venice did not bid farewell to its sons. It released them, as the sea releases ships, without tears, oaths, or guarantees. Marco knew he was leaving and did not know when he would return. His mother, according to some accounts, was already dead by then. Before departing, he visited St. Mark's Basilica. In the spring of 1271, 3 men, Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco Polo, left Venice. Their journey began with a sea voyage to Acre, the Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, and would then continue across the lands of the Crusaders through Armenia and Persia. They took gifts for the Great Khan, glass vessels, Western fabrics, miniature mechanisms, and samples of European craftsmanship, and a letter, not from the Pope, who had not yet been chosen, but from the papal legate Theobald, the future Gregory X. Marco took his first step on a road that would last not months, but years. He did not yet know that ahead lay the mountains of Pamir, the steppes of Central Asia, the palaces of Kublai, the golden cities of China, and a long voyage home by sea. But he stepped forward firmly and calmly. Everything else was still ahead. The journey of Marco Polo began in the spring of 1271. Together with his father Niccolo and Uncle Maffeo, he left Venice, crossed the Adriatic, and sailed through the eastern Mediterranean to Acre, a city that in the 13th century was both one of the last Crusader outposts in the Holy Land and a major hub of trade between Europe and the East. There, on the dusty docks where ships met caravans, they made their first halt. In Acre, the Polos received letters of recommendation from the papal legate Theobald Visconti, who would soon become Pope Gregory X. These letters were essential to prove at the Great Khan's court that their mission was indeed authorized by the Church. They also restocked their supplies, wine, oil, fabrics, and crafted goods that could serve as both gifts and trade items. Several guides joined them, men fluent in Persian and Turkic tongues. Their route lay through lands once part of Crusader states but now divided among Muslim emirs and local lords. From Acre they went overland, through Syria toward Antioch, then Aleppo, and further east into Armenia. The heat was oppressive, the roads dangerous, and they avoided delays. They traveled as part of a large caravan, merchants, pilgrims, and hired guards. Sometimes they slept in caravanserais, more often under the open sky, guarding their wares against thieves and beasts. In northern Mesopotamia, they stopped in Mosul, where local Jacobite Christians welcomed them with hospitality. The city was a bustling market, selling Indian cloth, Chinese silk, Turkish copper, and Persian carpets. There, Marco first saw objects already linked to the East: porcelain bowls, silk belts with symbols he could not read. It was not merely confirmation of his father's tales, but his first direct encounter with a culture beyond Europe's imagination. Their journey continued through Armenia, first lesser, then greater. They crossed lands ruled by Armenian princes and vassal emirs loyal to the Mongols. In the mountain city of Erzinca, they were hosted by a Christian lord who provided food and guards. Marco especially remembered a dinner conversation where he first heard of the road through the Zagros Mountains to Persia, of people speaking strange languages, and of a road that stretched beyond the horizon, where Kublai's rule was simply part of nature. Crossing the Caucasian foothills, the caravan faced treacherous paths and deep ravines. Sometimes they had to rebuild the road itself. Rains washed away the soil, streams turned into torrents. At one camp, Marco befriended a Persian merchant named Said, who knew the way to Herat. Said told him about Mongol governors, cities with chess tournaments, and the laws that kept the Silk Road in order. Marco listened and memorized. At night, he scratched brief notes on wax tablets. The first signs of Persia, ruled for nearly half a century by the Ilkhans, descendants of Kublai's brother Hulagu, appeared in the road guards, in coins inscribed with Turco-Mongol script, and in the orderly way stations at caravan crossings. The city of Tabriz, where the Polos arrived, was then the capital and largest market in western Persia. They stayed several weeks, and there Marco experienced his first cultural shock. In Tabriz's bazaar, Chinese parasols, Indian incense, Crimean furs, Andalusian knives, and Samarkand ceramics filled the stalls. Each booth had a story. Marco wandered like one enchanted. He saw astronomers charting stars on whiteboards, musicians playing unfamiliar instruments, and craftsmen weaving gold into fabric. There he realized that the East was not merely land. It was a system of knowledge unknown to the West. From Tabriz, they went south to Yazd, one of Persia's oldest cities. Surrounded by deserts, Yazd was home to Zoroastrians. In their fire temple, they were shown the sacred flame that, the priests claimed, had burned for more than 300 years. The city's rooftops were linked by bridges, the streets were narrow, and the air stood still. There Marco began to reflect seriously on time, how it flowed differently across cultures, why there was so much ancientness here and so little haste. From Yazd they rode to Kerman, the last major city before the most difficult leg of the journey. Kerman was famous for carpets and weapons, and here Marco saw curved sabers inlaid with turquoise and chainmail so fine it could be folded like cloth. The local governor, hearing that they were envoys of the Khan, received them with ceremony and granted them an official letter of safe passage through the eastern lands. Then came the desert of Dasht-i-Lut, the harshest stretch yet. By day the sand burned their souls. By night the temperature plunged and the wind carried salt and dust. One camel died of exhaustion, 2 porters fell ill, water ran short, and rations were strictly divided. But on the 5th day, they reached an oasis, and when Marco saw the first trees in the distance, he wept with relief. Beyond the desert lay a different world, rivers, steppes, and rolling hills. Persia, as he knew it, was behind. Asia, opened by the Mongols, began. Here there were no cities but forts, postal stations, tax collectors, and horsemen who could reach Samarkand in 2 days. Marco stood at the threshold of a new road, not the one drawn on maps, but the one used by envoys, merchants, and officials of the great empire. He was no longer a boy gazing curiously at a foreign world. He was becoming part of it, observer, witness, and slowly, storyteller. Ahead lay mountains and the lands where China began. After the Polo caravan crossed eastern Persia and left the blazing desert of Lut behind, their route continued through Khorasan, the vast region of eastern Iran where plains give way to mountains and caravan stations grow rare. They moved toward Balkh, one of Asia's oldest cities, known since the time of Zoroaster and Alexander the Great. Once called the Mother of Cities, by the 13th century Balkh had been partly destroyed by Mongol conquest, but remained a vital crossroads. They stayed in Balkh for several days. Niccolo and Maffeo traded, replenished supplies, and confirmed directions, while Marco listened to local tales. He heard the name Kublai, not from his father, but from merchants and wandering scholars. They spoke of him not as a tyrant, but as a lawgiver, a ruler who built roads and, it was said, governed half the world. An old man showed Marco a coin with a square hole, brought from northern China, and said that under Kublai even distant provinces paid taxes precisely, and thieves vanished of their own accord. From Balkh, they headed southeast through what is now northern Afghanistan. In those days it was called Bactria, a land layered with civilizations, where Hellenistic ruins stood beside Buddhist monasteries destroyed during invasions. They saw remnants of ancient walls, half-collapsed domes, rock-cut tombs, lands of forgotten kings, locals said. No one remembered who had ruled before, but everyone knew it now belonged to the Mongols. In one mountain village, Marco fell ill. He felt weak in the morning. By night, fever and vomiting began. On the road, they met a Sogdian herbalist who brewed a potion of mountain roots and told Marco to rest 3 days in the shade. The illness passed, but from then on Marco was cautious. He boiled water, avoided cold nights, and always kept a wool cloak even in heat. After several weeks they reached Badakhshan, a mountainous region in the east of modern Tajikistan, famed for lapis lazuli. Even in China, stones from there were prized. Villagers showed Marco bright blue mineral chunks wrapped in wool, saying the best ones were sent through Karakorum straight to the Khan's palace. The path grew steeper, rocks slid from slopes. At high altitude, air thinned, forcing long halts. To reach the Pamirs, they crossed the Wakhan Corridor, a narrow mountain passage at the junction of today's Afghanistan, Tajikistan, China, and Pakistan. It was among the harshest segments. Camels froze, horses stumbled, and people's hands cracked from the cold. At night, even in summer, the temperature dropped to 0, and the streams were icy. One traveler broke his leg and was left in a village under local care. Of the 30 who had left Persia, barely more than 20 remained. Beyond the passes lay valleys with nomadic pastures. Here the Mongols lived not in cities but in yurts, ruling open space. Marco saw the clans, men on horseback, women in fur hats, children herding sheep with poles. One rider, learning who they were, led them to the camp chief, a government officer authorized by the Khan to oversee travelers. There, in a tent pitched amid the steppe, Niccolo presented the documents and the papal letter. Marco remembered how the official studied the seals and asked what language the letter was written in. After consultations, the caravan was given a paisa, a golden tablet bearing Kublai's emblem, granting them the right to request horses and provisions at any imperial post. It was the key to moving forward, a sign of trust that opened doors in the farthest provinces. From that moment, the road changed. They were escorted, fed, and guarded. At every station, fresh horses awaited, sometimes with riders. The postal system of the great empire worked with astonishing precision. Every 30 to 40 kilometers stood a fortified post stocked with fodder, warm clothing, coal, saddles, and food. Marco marveled not at the size but the order. He wrote, "The great empire of Kublai is ruled not by the whip, but by rule." They traveled along what we now call the Silk Road, though they did not yet know its name. Caravans passed both ways. From the west came silver and wine. From the east, silk, paper, medicinal balms, rare herbs, and jade. In Samarkand and Bukhara, slightly to the south, tales already spread of a papal envoy bound for the Great Khan. Officials along the route asked Marco about Venice, the sea, and the Pope. He answered calmly, without boasting, yet felt more and more that he was listened to as a representative of an unknown world. Between the mountains of Karakorum and the rivers flowing from the Chinese side, the road forked, one branch southward to Kashgar and the Himalayas, the other eastward through Altai toward the imperial capital. The Polos chose the eastern way, shorter but more perilous. The air grew colder, trees vanished, people rarer. Yet now they traveled officially not as strangers but as bearers of the Khan's will. When beyond the final hill they saw the plain dotted with camps, forts, and the first outposts of northern China, Marco realized that not only Persia, but all of Europe was now behind him. He had passed through deserts, mountains, and glaciers, through forgotten lands, ruins, smoke, fear, sickness, cold, and solitude. He did not know exactly where China began, but he felt he was nearing the center of something far greater than a mere country. As Marco Polo approached the court of the Great Khan together with his father and his uncle, the road had ceased to be harsh and desolate. On both sides moved caravans laden with grain, cloth, porcelain, and salt. Coming toward them were officials, couriers, and guarded convoys. This was no longer a frontier, but a territory under the immediate control of the Mongol administration. Ahead lay Chengdu, one of Kublai's residences, to which he removed in summer to escape the heat of Kanbalik, his capital. At the city gate, the Polos' caravan was halted by guards. Their interpreter presented a golden paisa, the official tablet stamped with the Khan's seal that had been issued to them in the West. The documents were examined, the caravan was admitted, and a protected escort joined them. Roads near the residence were evenly paved. Stone lions stood at the turns. Within the city worked warehouses, stables, kitchens, and chancelleries. On both sides of the street stood wooden buildings with upturned roofs painted red, blue, and green. Everything was clean, orderly, and quiet. No one hurried and no one shouted, not from fear, but by established order. The Polo family were housed in a residence for foreign guests. They were assigned servants, an interpreter, guards, and a list of rules. They were forbidden to approach the Khan's chambers on their own, to visit the chancellery without invitation, or to speak with officials without escort. Everything obeyed a precise hierarchy. The father and the uncle negotiated with ministers, presenting gifts, letters, and goods they had carried across half the world. Marco, though younger, observed this not as a child, but as one earnestly grasping the workings of a new world. Their first appearance before Kublai took place after a few days. The audience was solemn, but not ostentatious. They were led through inner courtyards, past guards and officials, into a hall where, upon a dais, sat the Khan, a man broad of chest, with a black beard and a composed face. He spoke softly, in Mongolian. Nearby stood interpreters, court scribes, servants, and counselors. Niccolo and Maffeo bowed, and Marco did the same. Gifts were presented, papers delivered, and the exchanges were short and exact. Kublai, according to the court interpreter, remembered that Marco's father and uncle had already been at court and had departed with a charge to bring envoys from the Pope. Now, although clergy had not come with them, the family's arrival was received as a sign of respect. The Khan ordered that the guests be lodged honorably and said that in future he might make use of their knowledge. The first weeks at court were filled with observation. Marco saw how the postal service worked. Couriers relieved one another at prepared stations, transmitted orders, delivered goods, and returned with reports. He learned that the army was supplied centrally, that every official had a rank, a dress, and a ritual. The palace, though built of wood, had been arranged with such care that nothing occurred by chance. On one walk, he noticed scribes copying documents at once in two languages, Chinese and Uyghur, and in the morning, the court physician received reports on the health of senior guards and even of the cooks. In time, the Khan's attention turned to Marco himself. The young European spoke with restraint yet confidence. He knew the basics of Eastern trade, understood accounts, and could describe the roads of Europe, its ports and customs. When the court discussed sending someone on a diplomatic errand to the southern provinces, the Khan, at a counselor's suggestion, chose Marco, a man unbound to local nobility, yet capable of observing, remembering, and reporting without fear or partiality. His first journey was brief. He accompanied an official inspecting the condition of roads and the accuracy of tax collection. Returning after several weeks, Marco presented a detailed report. How many stations functioned properly, where postal horses were ill, where caravanserais lacked grain. He did not complain and passed no judgments. He merely listed facts. After reviewing the report, the Khan ordered that Marco be given the clothing of an official rank, granted him free entry to the archives, and included him among trusted envoys. Now Marco saw not only the capital, but the organization of the provinces. He visited villages where rice was grown, towns with adobe walls, and places where a temple stood beside the post of a tax collector. He watched officials organize markets, set prices, and settle disputes. Guards accompanied him, and in every city the local authorities knew that this young man rode in the name of Kublai himself. At court, he attended sessions of the chancellery, sometimes sat in on the Khan's conversations with ambassadors, and at times witnessed ceremonies. During one festival, when delegations from Koryo and Burma arrived in Chengdu, Marco was among the onlookers watching dances, musicians, sacrifices, and the presentation of gifts. In his notes, this celebration was recorded with precision: the composition of dishes, the weave of garments, the order in which guests appeared. Gradually, Marco became part of the mechanism. People knew him. They trusted him. Yet he did not lose his wonder. He wrote down how, in the province of Sichuan, women managed the shops, how in southern China paper money was printed, and how in the northern mountains a census was conducted. He understood that Europe knew nothing of this world and felt that it would be his task to convey this knowledge. One day, speaking with an elderly counselor, Marco asked why there were so few uprisings in China despite its multitude of peoples. The counselor replied, "Because everyone knows who he is, to whom he is subject, and for what he is responsible. Here order matters more than freedom, and people weary of chaos prefer the law." Those words stayed with Marco. He was no longer merely a merchant's son. He had become an envoy, a man living between worlds, able to speak to each in its own tongue. After Marco Polo became a trusted envoy at Kublai's court, his life turned into an unbroken road. He no longer remained in the capital. He was sent to provinces, to borders, to lands where the Khan's power was present not as decree but as word, as name, as trace upon the road. His task was to observe, to learn, to transmit. And he did this not hastily and not fearfully, but attentively, without prejudice, with open eyes and a lively memory. One of the first expeditions he joined followed the great river Yangtze. This route led through densely peopled regions where cities stretched along the banks like links in a single chain. Marco noted how barges carrying rice and salt moved downstream, manned by crews of 20 men and more. In one riverside village, he met an elder who explained that their settlement did not grow grain. It raised boatmen. The men left for navigation from youth, while the women kept the households and cared for the old. A little farther south, in a region of damp and misty climate, Marco found himself among peoples whose tongue and dress resembled neither Chinese nor Turkic. In the villages, houses stood on stilts, and at night herbs hung from beams beneath the roofs to repel snakes. There the official accompanying the caravan fell ill, and Marco, as the only representative of the central authority, negotiated personally with local elders, recorded the names of places, and observed rites in which women dressed in robes appliqued with the shapes of birds and frogs took part. He did not understand their words, but he felt the rituals mattered. Another assignment brought him to Yunnan, a broad, mountainous province in the empire's southwest. This territory had only recently been absorbed into the Mongol state, and local principalities still maintained formal submission to the Khan. There he first saw the washing of gold in mountain rivers. People stood knee-deep in water, sifting sand in woven baskets in the hope of catching even a single grain. He lodged in settlements where houses were joined by hanging bridges platted from living roots. One such bridge Marco described in his notes as a path stretched above an abyss that no eye can measure. There he met a monk who kept in his sleeve a tiny bird with a broken wing. The monk said he had found it wounded many years before and had not let it go since. Marco did not ask why he carried it. He merely kept the image, a fragment of a world that cannot be explained by numbers and scrolls. Later, Kublai sent him to the southern districts on the Burmese frontier. It was not a formal diplomatic mission, but reconnaissance. The Burmese kingdom was troubling. It was gaining strength, and the Khan's court wished to know what stirred upon the far border. The route was hard, Tropical downpours, wet forests, sickness. Several men fell ill. One was swept away by a mudflow, and Marco himself bargained with guides to keep to the way. When they reached the capital of a Burmese principality, the reception was courteous, yet restrained. The envoys were not allowed into the central palace, but on the ruler's behalf, they were given gifts: cloth, fruit, spices. Marco was struck by the order of things: temples with gilded roofs, huge images of lions and elephants flanking the gates, music that pulsed in choral rhythm and, it seemed, never ceased even at night. One senior priest told him through an interpreter, "Here everyone hears the Khan's steps, but no one has yet opened the door." Another road took Marco into Tibet. This was not a diplomatic charge, but an observing mission to see how imperial influence spread in the remote mountain regions. The road was exhausting. Passes, cold, lack of fuel. At night even tea froze in the kettles, and once the whole caravan was forced to go nearly a day without food because the horses could not climb a snowbound slope. One companion died, and they buried him among stones. There was no other way. In one monastery, Marco was allowed into the hall where texts were copied. Scribes in dark robes sat silent, dipping brushes in dark ink by turns, unhurried, undistracted, as if following the rhythm of breath. He noticed how they held the brush, braced by the little finger, the tip barely kissing the paper. He did not understand their language, but he felt these were people for whom silence meant more than speech. He returned from Tibet not with a formal report, but with an observation. Here live those who look to the sky and not to the throne. Therefore they cannot be conquered, only heard. Some of his journeys were not tied to specific orders. At times he accompanied tax inspectors, at times caravans of salt, at times bridge builders. He visited places where men wore long turbans and women rings in their noses that they never removed, not even at night. He described peoples who kept the heads of dead ancestors in special clay repositories, where children learned from earliest years not the names of kings, but the names of winds and birds. He did not always comprehend what he saw, but he always wrote it down. Some of his tales would later seem unbelievable. He claimed he had seen people sleeping in nets slung high in trees to avoid snake bites. He told of villages where men took no part in trade and lived apart, while women ran the markets. He recorded that somewhere they venerated smooth stones with holes through which, it was believed, one could hear the voices of dead relatives. Such details would make readers doubt, yet Marco added no ornament. He set down all he saw or heard, even when it defied explanation. He returned to court not as a merchant, not as a mere official, but as a man bearing within his memory the images of other worlds. No one asked whether he believed what he described. What was required of him was accuracy, and that he provided. At times he had to record cities without walls, at times markets where shells were used instead of money, at times temples whose altar held not an idol, but a mirror. None of this fit European ideas of the East, and Marco already knew. One day they would not believe him. But he kept writing, believing that one day someone would wish to understand what the world had been like before it was forgotten. When Marco Polo first arrived in Hangzhou, he noted in his records that he had never seen a city so wealthy, so orderly, and so populous. After months spent in mountains, provinces, and on the margins, he found himself in the heart of the crowded south, the former capital of the Song dynasty, which even after the Mongol conquest retained its stature as a foremost commercial and cultural center. There were no traces of ruin. On the contrary, everything spoke of prosperity built upon daily labor and exact administration. The city spread along the shores of West Lake amid canals, bridges, gardens, and quiet lanes. Each morning Marco watched boats push off laden with fish, rice, spices, and cloth. The boatmen doused their oars with warm water so the wood would not split. Women boiled tea at the landings. Officials, standing upon bridges, checked cargoes and stamped wooden tablets that served in place of receipts. In Hangzhou, order began not with decree but with routine. Every day, spare of words, yet precise. In the house of a respected merchant where Marco lodged by order of the court, he saw a large library containing hundreds of printed books. The pages had been struck from wooden blocks, the text carved in mirror image. There he was first shown paper money. The master explained that such notes were accepted throughout the empire, that their issue was controlled by the center, and that forgery was punished by death. The notes were covered with seals and devices, and despite their lightness, carried in the city the same force as silver. Marco remained in Hangzhou for several weeks. He visited the port where ships prepared to sail to southern provinces and archipelagos. He saw bales of silk loaded, chests of porcelain, sacks of dried ginger and bark. In the markets, he watched merchants offering spices, paper, lamps, tools, smoking blends, ceramics, and even prepared dishes. Street cooks made noodles and dumplings before their customers' eyes, folding them neatly into wrappers of palm paper. Everything happened calmly and swiftly. No one hurried, yet no one dawdled. From Hangzhou, he traveled to Suzhou, a city its people called the City of Water and Bridges. Dozens of canals crossed it, and at nearly every junction stood a bridge, of stone or of wood, single span or arched. Boats moved upon them as confidently as carts upon streets. Each quarter had its market selling goods of silk, lacquer, copper, clay, and wood. Marco visited a workshop where porcelain was made. Masters worked in silence, painting fine blue patterns upon wet clay. One explained, "Every line is repeated, yet never the same. Otherwise it would be not work, but a mere imprint." In Suzhou, as in Hangzhou, he attended closely to how life was organized. Each quarter had elders who kept order. Streets were cleaned on a regular schedule. Goods were weighed on scales verified by officials. Records of trade were kept daily. Even in street food, one felt a system. Portions, prices, ingredients, all could be checked. Once Marco watched a buyer return a dish and demand his money back, and the vendor, without argument, returned the coin. There was no fear upon his face, only the understanding that this was how things were arranged. Later he came to Kanbalik, the new imperial capital built by Kublai upon the site of the ancient city of Zhongdu. There Marco first felt how power could take the form, not of a palace, but of a plan. The city was laid out upon a rectangular scheme. Wards, streets, walls, all conformed to a design made in advance. Administrative buildings, warehouses, palace halls, military garrisons, each element had its place and function. The central palace, though built of wood, astonished by its size. Vast halls adorned with paintings, columns bearing high roofs, inner courtyards where ceremonies were held. In Kanbalik, Marco studied the postal system's arrangement. He saw the stations where horses were changed, how couriers received passes, of metal or wood, to travel through, how important documents were conveyed. The Grand Canal impressed him most, the waterway linking the capital to the southern regions. Along it moved barges with rice, salt, cloth, and building materials. Every consignment bore a mark and an escort, and arrived exactly on time. Marco noted how refinement and practicality were joined in China. In one chancellery, they showed him devices for calculation, counting frames by which complex reckonings were made. Elsewhere, he saw wooden cases of shelves that held sets of printing characters. He listened as officials debated harvests and tax returns and saw how those numbers became orders and then became action. He wrote of paper, used not only for writing but for wrapping, for books, and for money. Of gunpowder, employed not only in war, but in fireworks for festivals. Of tea, served in almost every home, unsweetened, but with respect. Of silk, which was not merely luxury, but part of daily dress. Of roads, broad and paved with even distances between inns. He did not see miracles. He saw organization. And the longer he lived within this world, the more he understood. The empire stood not only upon decrees, but upon trust. Officials received salaries and knew they would come on time. Merchants did not fear distant travel because they knew the road would be passable. Even the poor in the streets did not look lost. They lived within a system where each knew his place and could count at least on protection. And in the evening, as he walked streets lit by oil lamps, hearing conversations in tea houses, the rustle of paper in shops, and the wash of water at the quays, he felt that this was not merely a state. It was order turned into everyday life. And to him, a stranger, they had granted the chance to see it from within. When Kublai resolved to marry one of his kinswomen, Princess Kokachin, to the Persian Ilkhan Argan, the question arose of who could escort her across distant and dangerous lands. By land, the route was long and unsafe. Central Asia no longer obeyed the Khan's power without question, and the old roads had grown fragile. It was decided, therefore, to send her by sea, down the coast of southern China, past India, to the shores of the Persian Gulf. This mission was entrusted to a group of foreign envoys and attendants, among whom were the Polos. They were chosen not only for prior service, but because none of the other intimates possessed such experience in long journeys and negotiations with foreigners. By then, Marco was no novice. Behind him lay years of service, journeys to Tibet, to Yunnan, to the south, and to the Burmese borders. He knew how to speak with many kinds of people, how to conduct himself in unfamiliar ports, How to read the faces of those who did not speak any tongue he knew. Yet even he could not foresee how decisive this expedition would be, both for his family's fate and for their standing at the imperial court. Preparations were made in Zhenjiang, a great port on the southern coast. More than 10 ships readied to sail, a flagship carrying the princess, cargo vessels, escorts, and auxiliaries. On board were dignitaries, scribes, physicians, guards, servants, navigators, southern mariners, and northern officials. Each ship had its own route and task list. The Polos were assigned to the flagship and were responsible for coordination, observation, keeping journals, correspondence with ports, and reporting the mission's progress. It was not formal diplomacy so much as hard service in unpredictable conditions, with shifting winds and a gathering instability. Just before departure, Marco noticed a change in the court's atmosphere. Kublai, weakened with age, seldom appeared. Decisions took longer. Those who once supported the Polos had vanished or been set aside. New intimates, young soldiers and officials from the northern provinces, regarded foreigners warily. They were respected, but no longer deemed indispensable. Receptions once accompanied by conversation, gifts, and attention had grown cold and brief. Marco wrote in his notes that respect remained, but interest was gone. The run down the coast was not swift. Summer on the southern sea meant rains and strong tides. The ships moved slowly, putting into harbors to replenish water, dry clothing, and mend rigging. Illnesses appeared on board: fever, headaches, sleeplessness. Several sailors died. One ship's senior officer, a respected man, was found dead at dawn. Beside him lay letters. Marco ordered a sea burial in the local fashion, with a prayer and a strip of cloth embroidered with the Khan's emblem. At a halt off the coast of Champa, the south of present-day Vietnam, Marco faced local officials who were polite, yet indifferent. They were in no hurry to assist, citing heat, sickness, and lack of authority. He sought an audience with the governor for 3 days before being received, not because he represented the Khan, but because the princess was aboard one of the ships. An officer accompanying the delegation told him, "Here they acknowledge strength, not a name." At some anchorages they remained for 2 or 3 weeks. During one such stop on the coast of the Malay Peninsula, part of the flotilla was damaged by a storm. Sails had to be repaired, nails replaced, sacks of rice reloaded. Marco went ashore to meet merchants, Arabs, Tamils, Malays. He asked about India, the seas, the seasons. All spoke with one voice: "Be cautious," for the monsoons began at this time of year, and to cross the ocean was to risk everything. But they could tarry no longer. When the weather eased a little, the flotilla set a southwesterly course toward India's western shore. In a night storm, the ships lost sight of one another, and only after a week did they reassemble off the coast of present-day Kerala. There the Polos visited ports trading in pepper, gemstones, coconuts, and sandalwood. Marco noted, "Here the merchants are like princes, and the judges like collectors of salt." He spent several days in Kulik, Quilon, conferring with the local administration. They showed him warehouses for spices, cloth, and pearls. There he met a Persian interpreter serving at a local factory. Through him, Marco inquired about events in Persia, who held power, and learned that Argun, to whom Kokachin had first been promised, had died. But his son, Ghazan Khan, was ready to receive the princess as part of the dynastic union. This meant the mission remained in force, though its addressee had changed. While the expedition lay at anchor, Marco thought more and more about returning. He felt their time at court had passed. Respect remained, but ties had loosened. They were no longer trusted with offices or important negotiations, and their reports went unanswered. They had not been banished, but they were not needed. He wrote, "The great sun does not set. It simply ceases to shine upon us." They submitted a request to return, first through mid-ranking officials, then through old friends, then in writing. No answer came. One courtier, in a letter sent via the fleet's captain, wrote, "The Khan is silent, but the road is open." That meant, you may depart if you dare, but expect no formal farewell. When the mission with Kokachin resumed and the route was approved once again, the Polos understood. Now was their chance. Having fulfilled the charge and delivered the princess, they could withdraw. The Khan did not forbid, but neither did he detain. It was a pause into which one ought to depart. Their ship cleared the Indian harbor with a light cargo and a heavy heart. They left behind not only an empire, but almost 20 years of life. No one waved after them. There were no ceremonial send-offs. There were no seals. Only the sea, a harsh wind, weariness, and the desire to go home. When the ships escorting Princess Kokachin left the southern dominions of Yuan, no one could foresee how hard the return would be. The Polo family, Marco, his father, and his uncle, no longer expected to go back to Kublai's court. Their role there had waned, and the princess's escort had become the chance not only to complete a last duty, but to quit the empire with honor. The flotilla bound for the Persian Gulf consisted of roughly 14 ships, including the vessel carrying Kokachin. In the first days of sailing, trouble appeared. One ship ran aground and stove its hull. Its cargo had to be hurriedly transferred to neighboring vessels, and part of the crew died trying to reach shore by swimming. Upon reaching the Malabar coast, the first grave incident occurred. In one of the ports, the chief official responsible for organizing the route died. Panic spread among the servants, and a long layover followed. Marco assumed the coordinating duties. He drew up new lists, redistributed cargoes, and negotiated with the captains. Stores were spoiling. Tropical heat hastened rot. Rats overran the holds, and a struggle began for each barrel of water. During the passage across the Bay of Bengal, an epidemic swept the expedition. At first, there were 3 sick. After a week, more than 20. Fevers rose, vomiting, and weakness set in. The sick were isolated on a cargo ship, but infection soon reached the entire fleet. Marco recorded the dead each day, ordered clothing burned, and organized washings insofar as fresh water allowed. He was no physician, but he recalled the counsel of Chinese healers: keep the air dry, prevent stagnation, air the holds. At times it seemed useless. The smell of death had soaked into ropes, planks, and clothing. At Sumatra, the expedition made a forced stop. The island, with thick forests, villages at the water's edge, and broken terrain, proved a salvation and a new source of worry. Men were exhausted, ships needed repair, and the locals were not always friendly. The Polos set a camp on high ground and bartered cloth and weapons for food and water. Several men died of fever ashore, and the bodies had to be buried in the forest beneath tree roots. In camp, Marco enforced strict discipline. Water was boiled, watches were set with precision, food was issued by the clock. When the ships put to sea again, the monsoon struck. Waves hammered the hulls so hard that the timbers creak was heard even at night. One ship vanished, another lost its mast, and on a third a quarrel flared among officers over the division of supplies. Marco personally mediated, preventing the quarrel from becoming open mutiny. He understood. One more breakdown, and the expedition would dissolve. He ruled not by threats, but by authority. Men listened to him because over years of travel he had proved he could survive where others withdrew. They stopped at Ceylon to replace a mast and buy fresh provisions. There Marco first saw the temple rocks, carved images of the Buddha, vast statues ringed by the scent of sandalwood. In one village he spent an evening in the elder's house hearing tales of merchants from the north, of lunar cycles, of secret ports where gold was traded for spices. He wrote nothing. He simply listened, remembering how the palm rustled in the wind and how the evening smoke by the water smelled. At last they reached Hormuz. There, in heavy air thick with dust and the smell of camel camps, their mission ended. Princess Kokachin was handed with honor to the Persian delegation, and the Polos, for the first time in many years, were free of obligations. They sought no new charge. They sought the road home. From Hormuz they went north, through Yazd, the desert of Dasht-e-Kavir, then to Shiraz, and from there to Tabriz. These cities were familiar to them from merchants' tales, but now they became real. In Tabriz they first heard that Venetian and Genoese ships were once more struggling for control of the trade routes. That meant a homeward voyage by sea through Constantinople, and the Black Sea might be risky, but there was no choice. At one halt, between Shiraz and Tabriz, they came upon an oak chest that had traveled almost the whole way with Marco. It held scrolls, notes, textiles, samples of herbs, a broken astrolabe, and needles brought from China. It was their archive, unofficial, personal, full of fragments and the traces of real life. He closed it in silence, not knowing where and when the chest would be opened again, or who would read what lay within. When Marco Polo, his father Niccolò, and his uncle Maffeo set foot upon Venetian soil in the year 1295, more than 20 years had passed since the day they left their native city. First came a short halt in Acre, then the route through Anatolia and the Black Sea, and at last the home waters of the lagoon. They did not resemble the men who had departed. Faces weathered, skin dark, garments cut in the Chinese style, their speech scarcely held to its familiar Italian cadence. After 24 years of roads, deserts, palaces, and storms, the three men stepped upon familiar ground. Yet Venice was no longer the same, and their very return seemed almost awkward to the city. Rumors that the Polo family has returned from the east spread quickly. Some whispered of riches, others of madness, still others of sorcery. For no one returns from China, if indeed anyone reaches it at all. Their family house was occupied. Relatives, unbelieving in their return, had forged inheritance papers. They had to plead before the magistracy, relying on notaries, witnesses, archive copies, and above all, money. Several months were spent reclaiming at least what was theirs by right. Venetians famed for business sense nonetheless treated the Polos with distrust. They returned with wares unsaleable on the Rialto and in the markets. Their manners had changed. They spoke a little differently, dressed in a mingling of styles, told of things none had seen, of paper money, of stone bridges in cities with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, of inks that water could not wash away, and of roads where the emperor kept hundreds of stations with spare horses. The more they spoke, the less they were believed. Marco felt this most keenly. In conversation, he was called the Million, for what others took as a habit of exaggeration. His tales were interrupted, smiles flickered, topics were changed. He took no offense and offered no proofs. He knew what he had seen. He remembered each road, each customs post, every Persian caravan, each crooked line of mountain trail. He kept it, not as a claim to glory, but as part of himself. He tried to live quietly. In the house restored from neglect, he set his affairs in order, inventoried what remained, laid scrolls, maps, and samples into chests. At times, merchants visited, those who wanted to know more about the road to Persia. He shared what he could but did not strive to be a teacher. He simply answered questions. In the year 1298, another war broke out between Venice and Genoa. Marco, despite his age, joined the fleet. Historians dispute whether this was voluntary or because every man with means and a ship was obliged to serve. In one sea battle near the island of Curzola, the Venetian fleet was defeated, and Marco was taken prisoner. In Genoa, he was kept in prison among prisoners of war. There he met a man named Rustichello of Pisa, a scribe who had taken part in a crusade and was known for writings about knights. It was Rustichello who began to set down Marco's stories. This was not planned as a book. At first, they were simply evenings of storytelling, long, detailed, filled with names, routes, numbers, and descriptions. There, in that cell, without maps, without documents, without any way to check a fact, Marco began to speak aloud what he had stored within for many years. Thus began the work that would later become the famous manuscript. For now, it was only words. And no one, save the two of them, knew that those words would form the foundation of the most renowned travel book of the Middle Ages. The notes Marco dictated to Rustichello in the Genoese prison were not at first taken as a work that would outlive centuries. They were an attempt to hold in memory what was almost impossible to recount. Marco had with him neither maps, nor travel logs, nor objects that might serve as proof. All he possessed were his own memories, deep, vivid, and full of detail. Rustichello wrote in French, more precisely in a Provençal variety used among merchants and men of letters. He shaped the tales in the manner of a chivalric romance, adding introductory turns, heightening drama, at times smoothing the roughness of description. Yet the foundation of the text was lived experience. It was the first attempt in the Latin West to describe Asia not as an abstract India, but as a constellation of countries, cultures, and peoples, with their own customs, laws, armies, taxes, rituals, forms of dress, and speech. After his release from captivity, Marco returned to Venice. The manuscript remained with copyists. Soon the first copies began to appear. Their number grew, first a few, then dozens. Each new transcript differed from the one before it. In one, there were more numbers, in another, more marvels. At times, scribes abridged. At times, they added. It quickly became impossible to decide where Marco's own words ended and where the insertions of scribes and commentators began. Nevertheless, the book that later came to be called The Million, or the Book of the Marvels of the World, began to spread across Europe. It was read in France, recopied in Padua, debated in the monasteries of Tuscany. Merchants wished to know whether it was true that paper money was used in China. Cartographers searched the text for bearings, mountains, rivers, distances. Geographers argued over the true location of the city of Cheganor and how to reckon the march from Gansu to the shores of the Yellow Sea. Some admired it, others doubted. Many held that Marco had never been to China, that he merely listened to other merchants and set down second-hand observations. They were troubled that he did not mention the Great Wall of China, that he offered no detailed description of Chinese writing, that he rendered no Chinese names in exact transcription. Historians debate these matters to this day. Yet those who read attentively found in his account details no imagination could supply. The structure of the Mongol postal system, the yuan tax regime, courtly custom under Kublai, protocols of imperial audiences, and the geography of provinces from Tibet to Manchuria. Marco, like all travelers, did not command the language of science. He possessed another tongue, the language of the observer. He could remember how a road system was arranged, what salt depots looked like, where watchtowers were set, how many camels made up a caravan, who and how assigned the guards in a market. He wrote not of wonders, but of things he himself had seen. At times the book mentions people with tails, islands where giants dwell, mountains inhabited by snakes as long as a mast. Even these passages are more a reflection of the geographical tradition of the age than direct assertion. In the Middle Ages, any exotic thing was readily framed as a marvel. Marco almost always added, "I was told, I heard, they say." He kept separate what he knew from what he passed on from others. The book stirred a wave of interest in the East. It was read by those who later set out, merchants, pilgrims, adventurers. A century and a half later, Christopher Columbus would read it and make notes in the margins. Polo's book would be among the reasons to believe that the earth was vast, and that somewhere at its edge dwelt rich and powerful civilizations with whom one might make contact. Despite the fame the book brought, Marco himself long remained in the background. He did not attend festivities, gave no public speeches, and did not comment on disputed points in the text. New inventions were attributed to him, and he, according to contemporaries, was in no hurry either to deny or to confirm them. In the last years of his life, when copies of the book were being transcribed throughout Italy and his name was known even in far monasteries, Marco still lived a measured life. And to the end of his days, so they say, he did not renounce a single word. Even upon his deathbed, when asked once more whether he had embellished it all, he is said to have replied, "I did not tell even half of what I saw." After prison, after dictation, after returning, Marco Polo's life knew no more storms. He remained in Venice, in the same house he had once fought to reclaim, and lived quietly, almost withdrawn, like a man who had already had his fill. He sought no new journeys, made no effort to fortify his name, took no part in politics. All he deemed important had either been accomplished or told. His family life passed without gossip. He married, raised daughters, and kept his household. Little is known of his wife. The chronicles name her Donata Badoer, daughter of a noble Venetian line. She came from a circle where all was decided cautiously and with calculation. Yet their marriage, it seems, was not unhappy. He, though weary of the world, knew how to be patient and attentive, and she, brought up among merchants, knew the price of quiet at home. In his last years he fell ill more often. The native endurance he had built over the years, in steppes, deserts, and mountains, no longer saved him. In the city, with its damp air, drafts, and malachite mold in the corners of the walls, his joints ached and his cough lingered for months. Yet in spite of this, he remained a man whom others visited, sometimes for counsel, more often simply to listen. Young sailors, copyists, merchants' sons, all who had heard that a man who had stood at the court of the great Khan lived in that house wished to hear at least one name, one route, one detail. He was not rich in the ordinary sense. His property was valued moderately, and most of his income went to the upkeep of the house, dowries for his daughters, and alms for churches. And yet, he was held to be a substantial man, not for the number of coins, but for the wealth of memory he carried within. When his illness worsened and it became clear life was drawing to a close, Marco summoned a notary and began to dictate his testament. He mentioned his wife, his daughters, the household servants, and several churches to which he left alms. But most of all, he left the book, that same one dictated in captivity, as his legacy. He did not try to rewrite it, did not intend to abridge it, made no corrections. And, to the astonishment of contemporaries, he refused to recant its contents. He died in January of the year 1324. The burial was modest according to Venetian rite. His coffin was borne through the city, and only a few, passing by, recognized whom they were burying. No statue stood upon his grave, only a name. His memory needed no marble. After Marco's death, much time passed before Europe truly understood who he had been. His book continued to be copied, translated, abridged, and enlarged. Upon it, maps were drawn, treatises composed, legends invented. Some used it as a source, some as inspiration, some as a warning of how far the road can carry a man. Later, when the Great Silk Road became a symbol of the bond between West and East, the name of Marco Polo became a mark of an era. His story entered the common myth of the great world beyond the accustomed horizon. Even in the 20th century, when airplanes replaced caravans, ships replaced carts, and maps turned digital, his name was remembered. His road began in a port. Across sand and snow, rivers and passes, cities and palaces, he went, observing, remembering, bearing within himself a world others had not seen. He was neither saint, nor conqueror, nor reformer. He simply walked and told what he saw. And by that, he remained in history.